Okay, we're picking up tonight on page 82, the Lively Encounters chapter. This is the third. Last week we did two that are quite unconventional encounters. They don't, just on the face of it, seem to, quote, make sense. But let's see if we can try to make sense out of what doesn't seem to make sense, or not make sense out of what does, whichever way. But what I want to point out is that this one tonight, like the previous two, have to do with individuals who have been cultivating really sincerely with some depth and actually have some attainment. And so their reason for coming is not so much to receive instruction as to check out whether or not their attainment is legitimate or valid. So they're kind of coming for a final exam rather than to sit and become a student in that sense. So this one tonight is called Chan Master Hui Neng. And you notice that the last two were all titled by Chan Masters, whereas previously you had Bhikshu and so forth. So this is to indicate that these three individuals, they're not related in the sense that they probably knew each other, they might have, but what they're related in is that they're practicing this particular type of cultivation called Chan. And so they're really known as Chan Masters already by the time they come. So that means they probably have some followers of their own. They might even have monasteries. And but as with Chan, which is said to be somewhat of a direct understanding, when you look at the text describing Chan, you try to grab for something that confirms your understanding, and there doesn't seem to be anything there. So in this case, sometimes it's called attaining nothing to attain or getting nothing to get, which seems really paradoxical. And then some people think, well, because of this teaching is really not a philosophy. So I wanted to go into that question tonight too, again, whether this thing we call Buddhism or the Buddhist teaching is actually a philosophy. Or a couple months ago, I think I went through why I said I didn't think it was really a religion in the strict sense of how we formulate what a religion is. And tonight, I think with all three of these, we can start to make a case that maybe it's really not a philosophy, at least in the sense that we think of philosophy. Of course, we'll go away tonight saying, what is it? But that's all right, and we'll just leave that. So it starts with Chan Master Hui Neng of Yongjia, was of the Dai family of one province. When he was young, he studied the sutras and commentaries, was well versed in the Tiantai Dharma practice of calming and contemplating. Upon reading the Vimalakirti Sutra, he understood the mind ground. Okay, so background. This is his name, Hui Neng, but his actual, remember this is called the toponym, the top-down name. He's named after this area, Yongjia. To do that then is a sign of respect. So this is a respectful title he has. He comes from a certain province and so forth, not really too important. It says he started when he was young, which already indicates a kind of predisposition to the spiritual. In these teachings, it's sort of, the sense is that something called good roots, roots of deep spiritual goodness that people have seemingly to be born with from this tradition and from the text. It says these are accumulated over lifetimes. It's not just in one lifetime. And so life after life, when one is born, these can, if they accumulate to a certain degree, manifest very early. And you'll see even in a child a kind of inclination for goodness and wholeness and interest in spiritual questions, and correspondingly not so much gung-ho on competing, winning, succeeding, worldly things. A kind of, not a disdain, but just sort of a disinterest. which many parents perceive as a loser, but because the child's not driven by ambition to succeed. But often in this teaching, this is seen as a sign of having set their sights on higher goals. And even when they're young, they're inclined this way without knowing why. They don't necessarily even have to have teaching or read anything. It's just their natural disposition to be spiritually inclined. So this is an indication that it doesn't say how young he was, but usually this means at least teen or preteen. He was already studying the sutras and commentaries. We see this with other masters too, like Han Shan at a very young age was just really fascinated with Taoist and Buddhist teachings and thought, and couldn't read enough of it. And then one of the motivating moments was upon encountering someone dying. And this is one of the indicators. Most people, especially children, don't know quite what to make out of death when they encounter it. And a lot of people don't encounter it until they're quite old. But often children with these spiritual dispositions, when they encounter death, it's like it's more than a riddle. It's a stopper. It's a, what's this about? And so they start to contemplate. You see this in the Buddha's life too. Even at a young age, he started to ask these questions. Why is there suffering? Why does things pass? And why ultimately do we die? And most people just sort of roll on past these, but people with these roots don't. They sort of stay on this topic, and then they start to see that it's actually through selective perception that we don't notice that this is all around us, that things are passing and fading. Poets have this sensibility. They notice in the falling of leaves or the fading of a flower or something, larger forces at work that have to do with impermanence and passing. And because of their sensitivities, they contemplate this. They're really aware of it. This is also a sign of a certain good roots. Anyhow, Jiri talked about this, actually just a vipassana, or in Chinese, method of holding or bringing the mind back from 10,000 things to a self as a goal, but then that opens a way for, and so it's a kind of use of the mind rather than proliferating going on in a encyclopedia way to gather. This particular method says penetrating insight can come conversely by bringing the mind's attention back, drawing the sense organs away from sensory distraction and assimilation, and when, like a laser light that comes to focus, and then it can really penetrate. So he was familiar with this, and it says, upon reading the Vimalakirti Sutra, he understood the mind ground. This is pretty remarkable. If you've ever read the Vimalakirti Sutra, it's not, Winnie the Pooh. It's pretty significant text. And what I think is important about this passage here, it indicates that he was doing contemplation with study. He was studying sutras and commentaries. He was studying the Vimalakirti Sutra, but he was also doing this calming and contemplating. And I think it points to a method that we're still trying to replicate that's at the heart of this teaching, and why I might say I don't think it's really a philosophy in the strict sense, because the meditative contemplative dimension is absolutely essential for understanding the teachings. It's not like you do it on the side. In fact, you cannot penetrate the teachings only through rational logic or reasoning or argumentation. It has to be directly understood through a mind that's still. This is a very interesting thing. This was his teacher, that Tiantai teaching is very much in this school. It says, you cannot have study without practice, and you can't have practice without study. They have to go together. And Jiri, the master I mentioned to you, said it's like trying to wash your hand with trying to wash your hands with one hand. You need both hands, study, practice to wash the hands. He also compared it to a bird. And he said a bird takes 2 wings to fly. One bird, it just flops around. But with 2 wings, it can fly. Study, practice, lift the bird. So he used metaphors like this. And at his time, it was also to counter what he called Chan sickness at the time, where people were just sitting in meditation, no study whatsoever, and having all these altered states of consciousness and thinking this was awakening. And he saw this as what he called Chan sickness, so he was trying to combine not to overstudy, because that would be a mistake too. If you just go into seen it as an abstract philosophy with all these theories, and you do that, the Avatamsaka says that's like cooking all this wonderful food but never eating, and you starve to death. So you have to get the blend just right between study and practice. Anyhow, obviously he's coming from that tradition, and I want to point this out because he's a Chan master. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about the Chan school that it has to do with not use of words and language, not use of text. It's just direct sitting meditation, you get it. But you can see from this that it's that combination of sitting, meditation practice, and deep study. And it's not just, oh, you study, then you sit. No, you study, then you sit, and you sit, you see the meaning of the study, and they go back and forth, mutually rubbing each other until they get brighter and brighter. This Master Juri I mentioned, I think a couple weeks ago, before he even began sitting meditation, not only did he study, but he did 20 years of bowing. 20 years of bowing. So 20 years of bowing. Question. Oh, you say, in some deep way, sit and penetrate has to really be still of karmic obstacles and remorse from things that you've done. And so part of bowing is a cleansing of the heart to empty out all that entanglement that allows you then when you sit to really move along. Anyhow, one day he happened to meet a master's disciple. This is a disciple of Hui Neng, Xuanzi. Where did we meet Xuanzi before? Anybody remember? I thought we met him earlier. Well, we may read him later. Xuanzi, and they had an engaging discussion. And everything that Xuanzhi said implicitly accorded with the teachings of all the patriarchs. So Xuanzi asked him, kind sir, who did you receive the teaching from? So the disciple of Master Hui Neng hears him talking and says, he's right on the same stuff that I've learned. He's really in the same vibe, same understanding. And Xuanzhi replies, I heard various Mahayana sutras and Shastra texts from different masters, and later when I read the Vimalakirti Sutra, I awakened to the source of the Buddha mind. And yet, however, no one has certified my realization. So we have to imagine him saying this probably not in an arrogant manner. What he's being asked was, wow, you really got it. This disciple of Hui Neng is saying to him, and he's wondering where he got it, what was his teacher. And he said he did all these studies, and through the study and his own practice, he had a profound realization. But at the same time, he points out that he hasn't been certified in this. So he's not like saying, I really got it. He's just saying, I think I got it, but I'm not sure. And then Xuanzi says, yeah, self-certification was acceptable before the time of the first Buddha, king with an awesome voice. But after him, all who enlighten without a teacher risk falling into misguided naturalism and outside the way notion. In other words, I can just spontaneously have my awakening, and I don't have to have it checked out by anybody who's actually experienced that as well. And outside the way notion just means it's outside of the Dharma, it's outside of the nature of things as they are. It doesn't mean it's another religion. Some people interpret this way. That's not what it means. It just means it's outside of the mind ground teaching, outside of the fundamental understanding of the truth coming from within your own person. So Xuanzhi asks him, then will you please certify me, kind sir? And Xuanzi replies, my words carry no weight. But at Shaoxi, there's a high master of the Sixth Patriarch. Students gather there from all over, like clouds, to receive the teaching from one who has the Dharma. If you want to go, I will accompany you. So here, Xuanzi, although he is understanding and hearing him, also says, I'm a student like you. I can't certify you. I don't have the gravitas although I think you got it. So let's go together. And off they go. Xuanzhi then went with Xuanzi to call in the master. And arriving, okay, so here we have another case in point. Now, hope all of you will remember all the different arrivings and encounters when we get here, because here's another one. right? So they arrive, and arriving, Xuanzhi circumambulated the master 3 times, shook his ring staff. So they have these staff. I don't think we have a ring staff here. You ever seen one of those?
There's one in the rebirth hall.
Where?
In the rebirth hall, just
Go get it. And shake it. I mean, a real one, right?
I think it's real.
Is there one back there, Locke? This is fun. You got it? Yeah! Wow, this is great. Okay, so what I want you to do is just pretend you've circumambulated the teacher 3 times, and now you stand there and you boldly in front of him and you shake the ring staff.
Right, pound it down.
Both and shake it and pound it. Yeah, okay. This is announcing your humble presence. Yeah, so the online people can see this. So what he does, he circumambulates 3 times, and, well, I hope this doesn't fall on me, because I won't get awake and I'll just get knocked out. Well, this is really awesome. Wow. And he stands, circumambulates 3 times, he goes, I'm here. Okay, got it? Great. And he stands boldly in front of him. The master said, a Shramana carries himself perfectly, guided by the 3,000 forms of deportment, 80,000 subtle ways of behavior. Where do you come from, great worthy one, that makes you so conceited? So what a Shramana is just another word for a monk, coming from the Sanskrit, in different ways to interpret, but shram can mean to engage in bitter practice almost, to really austere, and can reform to a kind of form of asceticism, spiritual asceticism. And he says, but when you cultivate this, you manifest a deportment and a behavior that is very controlled and disciplined and proper. And part of the training is, and it's not, sometimes people say they're trained to do it. It's just like boot camp. You learn how to salute and stand and everything. But this is done in 2 ways. You not only learn that, but you learn the mind or heart it comes from. So that even in unexpected situations where you haven't been trained, your deportment manifests according right from the inside out. So it's not just a studied way of behavior, but it's actually an inspired way that comes from calmness and being centered and being pure. And so it's really, and this says people that have this deportment, even alone in their room, they have this, no, I wouldn't say it's elegance, a dignity. And they never leave this. So whether they're out in public or alone in their room, they never leave that kind of graceful composure. And he's saying, you have not shown this at all by just walking, and you didn't even bow, you just bang, 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 here I am. So Xuanzhi said, now remember, before this happened, right, somebody came and didn't bow, and this turned into a big heavy-duty teaching. And then the student ended up crying because he didn't realize how arrogant he was. And what does Xuanzhi say? He doesn't say, sorry, I apologize, I forgot myself. He says, birth and death are a grave matter, impermanence comes swiftly. What does he mean by that? What makes you so conceited that you just bypass all the standard conventional behavior here, and then you say birth and death are a grave matter, impermanence comes swiftly? Come on, guess.
He doesn't have time for nicety.
He doesn't have time for niceties. He's, remember when the Sixth Patriarch came, they said, what are you here for? And he said, I just want to be a Buddha. And the Sixth Patriarch did the same thing. So this is kind of funny. It's almost repeating what the Sixth Patriarch did. Only he didn't come with the staff and everything. He was just a pure little woodcutter. But the same message. So the master replies, why don't you seize the essence of it, that there is no birth and no swift either? Now this is not a normal conversation, folks. So I'm just pointing this out, right? And even if we did this, if we just did Xuanzhi, the master said, and then I as my test, we put blank Xuanzhi, then we put the master, we put blank Xuanzhi, and I ask you all to fill in the answers. And you would not necessarily fill these in, I'm guessing. Some of you might get a little bit, but it just doesn't, you're expecting him to say, so if you want to end birth and death, you can't be in a hurry. Okay, but he doesn't say that. He says, why don't you seize the essence of it? There is no birth and no swift either. Then he replies, the essence is birthless and understanding basically has no speed. Whew. And the master says, so it is, so it is. Now come on. The master could have said, you ignoramus, or he said, you arrogant, or something. He says, so it is, so it is. So what I'm suggesting here, or what the text seemed to be suggesting, that there's a meeting of the minds here through this convoluted conversation, that he doesn't need to be tested for his arrogance the same way someone else did who came who didn't bow. And his exchange, the answers he's giving, indicate that he was probably close to right, that he did have a profound understanding. Because the so it is probably the highest, I wouldn't say it's the praise, the confirmation that masters give to disciples as they're coming along. And sometimes this is translated as Ru-shur, it's thus. Now remember when he went to another place earlier and they asked him, what did you discuss and what did you talk about and how was it transmitted? He said, we just talked about seeing. There was no discussion of passing on. So the seeing is thus. It's just saying we see it clearly. Now what's being suggested here is, what does this conversation have to do with it then? So this is where I want to get into whether this is philosophy, but let's keep going. Xuanzhe only then bowed with full and perfect deportment. Now this is very interesting. He didn't do it before, but now he does a really sincere bow. And then a short while later he announced that he was leaving. And the master said, are you leaving rather quickly? And he answered, funnily I don't move, so how could I be quick? And so you could say, well, the master was asking him really to kind of stay longer, because he maybe thought this would be fun to hang around with someone who understands, because they got all these disciples who don't get anything, and I'm with them all day long. It's fun to have somebody you could have a conversation with, or a conversation without words. That would be even more fun. But he says, his answer is, he's still in the repartee, I don't move, so how could I be quick? And the master said, who knows you don't move? And he replies, kind sir, you are making this discrimination yourself. And the master said, you truly understand the meaning of birthless. And then Xuanzhe comes back and says, how can birthless have a meaning? If it has no meaning, then who makes this discrimination, the master asked. Xuanzhe said, discrimination itself has no meaning either. And the master explained, excellent, please at least stay for one night. From then on, he was known as Overnight Awakened One. Later, he wrote the Song of Awakening, which circulated wisely. His posthumous title became Wuxiang, Great Master Beyond Knowing. And in his time, he was known as Truly Awakened Zhenzhui. So, there we have the rough story. I thought if I had time, I would just read you the first lines from This is his song. It's been translated, and it's called the Song of Enlightenment or the Song of Awakening. And it's Great Master Yongjia. Now Yongjia, remember, was that toponym that he was given from where he was from of the Tang Dynasty. So if we have a little time, I'll read you that first section tonight. So let me launch into something here a little bit. See if we can try to understand. In these last three discourses, you see these conversations that don't seemingly follow a line of reason or logic or discourse, but they seem to be jumping back and forth, and it's really hard to figure out how one would parse these. In other words, even if you put your head to it, could you actually get at what this is talking about? And many people try. Maybe try to analytically get at what that exchange was about. I want to suggest something else, that the purpose of the exchange is not to convey a teaching or a philosophy or even a principle, but rather a test to see if the person has really understand the teaching. And understanding the teaching, if we get at it through this text, is that there's nothing to get, there's nothing to attain. That the nature is whole and complete by itself, it lacks nothing. Wonderful enlightenment is our innate possession, and only because we covered over with grasping and seeking and confused thinking does it not manifest. So the purpose then of the teaching isn't to convey a philosophical argument or truth, but rather to liberate someone from that confused thinking and those attachments. So the teaching then becomes rather therapeutic and operative rather than final or definitive. This is the Buddha's truth, is not the approach. This is a liberative technique that allows you to discover the truth within your own self. Therefore, there's no consistent systematic teaching, but rather a series of expedient devices, or you could say events or encounters, whereby someone is liberated through a temporary teaching or a medicine the Buddha uses to try to liberate them from that attachment and confused thinking. It's not to pass on a philosophical school of belief or understanding. You're sort of getting where I'm going? So the measure is when he says, to the awakened person, all time and places are the same. There is no birth and death because there's no setting up even in that identity to have a beginning and going. And then he says, let your mind be unattached, clinging to nothing. That's nothing. That's the heart of the teaching. So this exchange is really nothing more than to see if the person is still clinging to something. You see what I'm saying? So he wanted to see, is he clinging to something? Because he comes and goes bang, bang. So are you kind of clinging to your ego? So he pokes him, well, you know, what is this all about? And his answer is, birth and death is the great matter. I don't have time to be polite. Okay, so it's indicating a seriousness of purpose. He's not coming to be flattered. He's saying, I'm coming because there's an urgency. That's a good answer. But it still doesn't indicate what his understanding is. So he pushes him a little further. And he asks, you know, he goes through, if you look at it, these are a series of scenes. Are you setting up anywhere? He says, so why don't you see, there is no birth and no swift either. If you really understand that, there isn't any that. There's not even that, because there's not any attachment in the most basic sense. And then he answers again with an answer that indicates that he's not attaching or clinging to his views. So he's just, it's almost like a pushing hands between two masters, pushing hands being the Tai Chi. Everybody know that one? Oh, when there's an exercise in Tai Chi where you actually join hand or hands, and you go back and forth and try to throw the other person off balance. And so you don't move until the other person moves, but when the other person moves, you move twice as fast. So if they push, you yield. If you push, they yield. And wherever you stop, you're stuck and you get turned over. So this is called pushing hands. It's really wonderful. You have to be totally nimble and unattached to move like this, no matter how it's pushing. So there's a kind of pushing hands going on at a deeper sense here. Is there any place I push that he will get stuck and turn? And he doesn't. He keeps staying nimble, unattached. And it's not like he's trying real hard. He's actually just being natural. See, this is the point. Because some people think, I can master this thing and I can go into a great teacher and we can have this. And then he'll ask you, or she'll ask you a question and you go, oh, damn, I wasn't ready for that one. You know, and you go back to your koan book and try to find the answer to the riddle. It's so fast, it's happening, and he's throwing out things that are not thrown out to anybody else. You see each one of these as a different conversation. So even if you had eavesdropping in the next room and heard it, and then he comes out and he gives his first reply, the next question will be unexpected. So there's no cheat sheet here. You can't prepare for it. And he's being pushed in this way. Even on Are You Leaving, he comes back again. And so basically, in the end, he passes the test because there's no place he's setting up. But, and this we need to be very careful about, this is not a, you know, sort of a, how you say it, radical relativism or nihilism. He's not saying nothing matters at all. He's actually saying, because I've understood and seen through the emptiness of all things, I have now entered this wondrous state of awakening where I'm unattached, unbound, and everything is okay. And that's the confirmation that happens. And not like he says, yeah, I can keep going with nothing matters, nothing matters. But that's not what's happening here. So it's not that kind of thing. What happens when those attachments and confusion stop, that's said to be the awakening. You open up into a profound understanding. You don't fall into a void. So I'll share something with you. Thinking about this, because I was asked to respond to this question and with some colleagues about whether Buddhism is a philosophy, whether it's a religion, and whether it's a science. These were the three areas. And I already shared some of the stuff we were doing on the religious part. I won't go over that tonight. But on the philosophy part, when we think of philosophy, usually in the Western sense, now philosophy, technically means love of wisdom. So of course, this is a love of wisdom teaching. But any of you who have taken philosophy courses at the graduate and undergraduate level must surely realize that this is a bit different than that. Okay, so if you haven't, you should try it and you'll see. So philosophy generally, as it's practiced now, is a very intellectually based, analytical, systematic approach to reasoning using logic and argumentation to establish positions that you try to defend and hold to and so forth. There was a famous scholar at the University of Chicago, and I'll quote you what he said because it's really interesting. He said, "You have to think of the Buddhist teachings not as a philosophy, but more of an event, like a happening, a sequence of dialectical responses pragmatically concerned with ending human suffering by liberating the mind from attachments." Very different than just coming at philosophy. And therefore he concluded that we accept that this is the fact and that it is not a philosophy and that is not the expression of the Buddhist ultimate concern to be philosophical in this way. You will understand that this teaching is not something you sit down with, and he says, it's not a conception about which we may calmly converse in sovereign detachment about. He said, if you understand it's not that, you're at the gateway of understanding what it is. So this is and this is a Western philosophical, historical teacher, not necessarily Buddhist, but he looked at it carefully and said, it doesn't fit the category of philosophy, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have rhyme, reason, and system to it. It's just very, very different. So part of this has to do with, if you try to wrap your mind about these teachings, it's really hard because it refuses to gel or even stand still. You see what I'm saying here? Okay, so I ask you, please tonight, based on these three dialogues, put together a systematic philosophical position, and you say, He's one person he does this to, one person he does this, one person he says empty, one person he says permanent. He's all over the map. It just doesn't sit still or gel. And then some people conclude the Buddha was confused. He contradicted himself constantly. And it's made further, or was inconsistent, so was not systematic. Then some people will also say, it's difficult because we want to look at what he wrote. I mean, if I asked you to say study Kant, you look at Kant's writings. You want to study Nietzsche, you look at Nietzsche's writings, right? Look at the Buddha's writings. Actually, he didn't write anything. Whoa. Okay, so this is a little difficult because he didn't sign it, the Buddha. He didn't have a book signing with the sutras. And people say, well, it's all these discourses were put together posthumously after the Buddha, as much as 200 to 300 years afterwards. So there's no writings. And then it's complicated further, you want to get at this philosophically, because the Buddha himself resisted nailing it down. He said it's by nature, the word we use now is plastic. It's malleable. It's shaped and formed according to what's appropriate to the particular conditions of an audience or an individual, in what's needed not to convey truth, but to untie knot that prevents truth from manifesting itself. So one of the words for this is paryaya, which means indirect route. And sometimes also another word is upaya, meaning expedient means. But indirect route and expedient means you come at it not directly, but through a series of untying attachments and thoughts. So different things were taught to different people at different times based on their differing sensibilities, prejudices, questions, and capacities. So if you try to put this into a systematic philosophy, you're always in a context that is looking at sensibilities, prejudice, questions, capacities, and the teaching is deemed appropriate, but not finally and ultimately true. It's operative rather than definitive. You know what I'm saying? So it's not like the word is. The word is for this person at this time, according to that capacity, was such and such. That doesn't mean the word is to the different situation the same. So this really is sometimes hard for people to get at. So what I'm saying, and this is my argument, I don't want to get into a whole thing about it, but I don't think it's a useful way to look at these teachings as some systematic exposition of a philosophy, of reasoning on the nature, reality, and knowledge as such, but more, given a Buddha analogy, of a makeshift raft. In other words, it's not a rock cathedral truth thing, but rather this makeshift raft. And I'm using the Buddha's analogy. This is from the Alagada Pumpama Sutra. Sorry for my pronunciation. I can see Feta smiling, but it was close, wasn't it?
I don't remember the title. So.
Okay. Oh, so polite. Okay. But the Buddha uses this analogy. He says, you use the raft, you throw it together, get one shore to the other. And that's all. Once you're on the other shore, you let go of the raft. You don't cling to a philosophy. And you don't even see it as an ultimate truth. And the only reason it arises is because you need to get one shore or the other. If there wasn't an issue of getting to the other shore, why would you even be interested in a raft? So this is how he talks about his own teaching. It's not like I'm making this up. So if he's talking about it in that way, we have to be cautious not to turn it into the Queen Mary or the Rock of Gibraltar. It's merely meant as a raft. So that makes it seemingly inconsistent. But I would say it's not. It's actually very precise and very exquisite because it is catered to each person's individual capacities. What I need to learn or wake up to is not necessarily what you need. And what good would it be to you use your method of awakening on me when I don't need it? Or I couldn't get it, my capacity couldn't hold it. So, but because it's maybe inconsistent, it doesn't mean it's incoherent and it's not incomprehensible. So that's why I'm saying it's not philosophy either, that it's just totally irrational. That would be a wrong to jump to that either. It's very different than any philosophy we normally think of. Just as I said, if you call it a religion, it's very different than any other religion we actually have categories for. It doesn't quite fit most of our Western categories of religion, and now tonight I'm saying philosophy, and sometime later I'll do the science thing, because it doesn't fit that either. And yet, it is kind of scientific, but it's not our science. So this is... what I'm trying to sort of get at. And then you can understand why Hui Neng himself, when asked for his philosophical treatise, please, Hui Neng, before you go, leave us your philosophical treatise, leave us your teaching. And what did he say? Remember, if I had a teaching to give you, I would be deceiving you. Depending on the situation, I merely use expedients, upaya, to untie people's knots and provisionally call it a teaching. So I'm saying not only Hui Neng was this way, but the Buddha himself was this way too. And it seems like all of these sages follow the same thing. They either don't write things down, or when they write them down, say don't pay too much attention to it and don't cling to it. Even in the Nirvana Sutra, they said, you're about to leave, will you give us your final teaching? And he said, I had no teaching in the beginning. I don't have any teaching at the end. Birth and death, the one great matter, get to work, bye. He didn't write it down, he didn't make it, because he knew in writing it down, you make it then into a rigid ideological position, and people will cling to it. Not when they cling to it, they'll hit you over the head with it. The Buddha said, the Buddha said. And so by leaving it in a dynamic, fluid way, he was pointing to the fact that no teaching is a teaching unless it pragmatically liberates. Now this is interesting. If that teaching does not pragmatically liberate, it is in fact not the teaching. Whoa. This is a very different notion. So the measure of it is its existential liberating function and not its statement of any absolute truth. So, not only the Buddha not writing anything down, it was all written down after his passing, and he even said to be careful of attaching to the written word. And not only that, but it's an open canon as opposed to a closed canon. Do you know what I mean by that? A closed canon means it was done, it was said, it was written down, and it's over. And the open canon means it's still being spoken, it's still being written, it's evolving. Case in point, this is not from India, this is from China. This is from the Tang Dynasty, it's not from the Sali. And right now, there's probably some Buddha coming into being in Europe and America. I don't know who or she is, he or she is, and when they come, they will speak the Buddha's word, Buddha Vachana. And it won't be, thus I have heard before, it'll be, it's like this now. Right? This is the elasticity of an open canon. So some people get very nervous about this. But in fact, it's this very liveliness that allows it to go forward and have purchase into changing times. Now, I want to read you one final thing before I close because I really like this. The Buddha had a foster mother. It was his mother's aunt. Remember? Anybody know her name?
It's Mahaprajapati.
Mahapajapati. And she wanted to become a nun, and the Buddha then allowed a number of women to become bhikshunis, or women sangha, fully ordained. And she wanted to get the teaching in a nutshell. So she went to the Buddha. I love this because it's an aunt. She really respects him, but she also brought him up. And she knows that when she talks to various people, they go, they go on and on about the Dharma. And she's just going to him and she's saying, okay, just give it to me straight. Give me it in a nutshell. And here's what he said. And her name then was Gotami, her name. And he said, of whatever teachings, Dharma, Gotami, you can assure yourself, these teachings, this is a teaching, because I said it. Now you're all supposed to go, no! No, he didn't say that. This is a teaching because it's in the sutras. No. This is a teaching because Ananda said it. No. This is a teaching because we found it in a cave. No. This is a teaching because everybody handed it down from generation to generation. No. This is a teaching because you dreamed about it. No. Why is it a teaching? This is very interesting. It's not culturally passed on. It's not dream passed on. It's not even a teaching because I said it. And this is very curious. So why is it a teaching? This is really neat. I love this passage. Okay. It is a teaching because it leads to dispassion, not to passion, to freedom from bondage, not to bondage, to decrease of possessions, not to increase, to fewness of desires, not to their many expanding, to contentment, not to discontent, to solitude, not to over-socializing, to exertion and not to laziness, to ease in maintaining oneself, self-mastery, not to difficulty and anxiety. Indeed, you may consider this is the Dharma, this is the Vinaya, and this is the teaching of the teacher. So, by definition here, this key word that's used in the Buddhist thing, what was the word of the Buddha, which is called Buddha Vachana? The Buddha is saying, it's not what I spoke, but what I spoke is this. What any Buddha speaks is this, and because they speak it this way, it makes it the teaching. Not because they're Buddhas, but because it's true in liberating these things. There's a slight difference here. So it's not what he spoke, but anybody who speaks a teaching that leads to these qualities of liberation is the word of the Buddha. So this becomes a really interesting definition, because what that means is it isn't bound by an ism, it isn't bound by a place or an ideology. Whatever causes this kind of deep liberation and opening up and freeing is the word of a Buddha, not the Buddha, a word of a Buddha. So a quite different definition. And you can see why, when you have this as these backgrounds, the plasticity of it, the fact that it's just an expedient device, that it has these qualities which are not intellectual qualities per se, but liberating emotional, psychophysical, spiritual qualities, why it's really hard to put this in the category of a philosophy. And yet it's not to say that it's just, Hutu, helter-skelter, anything goes. So I just wanted to, should we do Yungjia? Okay. You maybe get a flavor of Yungjia. So this is an early translation. I'm sure there's new ones out now. And I won't, if we had Iwan here tonight, I'd have her sing it, because it should be sung. And I am not going to try that. Hang Sure does that, but he did it singing it in English. So I will not sing it. I will just read you the first section. Have you not seen people whose study has ended, who do nothing and abide in the way at ease? They do not banish false thoughts. They do not seek the truth. The true nature of ignorance is the Buddha nature. This empty body and illusory transformation is the Dharma body. In the Dharma body's enlightenment, there's not a single thing. And its source, the essential nature, is the Buddha of spiritual innocence. The five skandhas, like floating clouds, emptily come and go. The three poison, like bubbles, water, rise, and sink, unreal. And on. So this is quite an extensive. This is the poem that he wrote upon his awakening. And we could spend a whole semester going through this poem, but it's you can see in here this idea that the enlightened person is seeking nothing, there's nothing to get, and yet they're free and at ease because they've let go of all attachments. That first line, have you not seen people whose study has ended? And again, you see here, it doesn't mean that they stopped studying and they just sat. It means they mastered the studies and now they can go on to their practice, because that was his own experience, right? So people misinterpret this and say, oh, you don't have to study, you don't have to look at text and commentaries, all you have to do is sit. And if you look at this carefully, especially with his own experience, you see he was doing them simultaneously. But he's saying study has an end. It's when you get your PhD. When does study end? It could be never, but it says here, their study is ended. They do nothing, and they abide in the way at ease. So, at this exchange, the study's over. He sends them on, right? In many words, when study leads to understanding and awakening, you no longer need to study. And yet bodhisattvas make vows to continue to study, to learn the ways of teaching and transforming other beings. So they vow to be born in world after world, learning the languages, the culture, the sciences, and the arts of those peoples. They study because they want to be able to teach and transform. But here it's suggesting that the goal of study is not to go on studying forever, but to take the medicine so it can cure you. But if you accumulate the medicine and don't really take it, all you have is a huge pharmacy, right? But you haven't swallowed it. So this is very important. I'll close with one of my favorites, because this is actually from the Zhuangzi, but I've done it before. So, but it's similar to this, about what study and words are for. Because Sixth Patriarch heard a sutra line and got awakened. He gets a Vimalakirti Sutra and has an awakening. It doesn't say then he went back and held to the sutra. So here's the thing from the Zhuangzi. You've heard it before, but it's a wonderful line. So Zhuangzi says, the net is used to catch the fish. And once you catch the fish, you can get rid of the net. The snare is used to catch the rabbit. Once you catch the rabbit, you can get rid of the snare. Words are used to catch meaning. Once you catch the meaning, you can get rid of words. And then this wonderful closing line I like. Where can I find a person who knows my meaning, knows my sound, so we can have a conversation without words? Now that conveys what's going on here between the two masters. They're actually having a conversation, but it's not about words. You see, it's about something else. We might think, and we're going word. Now he said this, A and B, if B equals C, then we do this whole syllogistic analysis of it, and we miss it completely. Because they're not having a conversation about words, they're having a conversation without words that's getting that meaning that they both understand already. So this is really pretty cool. And yet it's not a game. Some people think, oh, this is a game, it's a little riddle game. It's not a riddle game. It's actually just a sort of affirming that they really got it, even past the words and language. Somebody who didn't have it, really in their heart, did not really get it, could say this exact same thing to the Sixth Patriarch, and the Patriarch say, fart, fart, you don't have it. And you say, well, I said all the right things. It's not quite like that. You see, it's not so like you memorize this thing and you'll get a profound understanding. And actually he says to another disciple, he said, if you can forget my words, maybe you might get the meaning. But he had to have the words to start with, and then to forget them and get the meaning. So this is what I'm pointing to. This is not like any philosophy you'll study in undergraduate or graduate school. It's a very different thing. But that is not to say that it's not profound and it's not really thorough. Anyhow, enough tonight. Any questions? Yes?
I'm just curious about the conversation between the two masters. So did the Sixth Patriarch untie the knot for Master Songche in that conversation at all? Or did he just certify Master Songche?
That's a very good question. I see it more, and everybody can weigh in on this, but I see that Master Yongjia came with the knot untied, but not for sure did he know it was thoroughly untied. So it was more like a test, and each question and answer thing showed that he really had untied it. And he pushed him again and pushed him again, and finally it came up. He passed every test, and so it wasn't so much untying a knot as confirming that he had already untied his knot, but needed that extra sort of exchange to have confidence that he had. And it's really interesting because when you don't have a teacher like that, what do? You Google a sage. I mean, you just go Google up and you start a conversation. I'm waiting. One thing, I know I do this when I call some store, and then you want to have a conversation with somebody, and then you click, right? You can imagine this going on, and but you can't I don't think you can do that. I don't know if there's any masters online that you can do that with. You want to start one here at BBM? You can sit at your computer and people can have a conversation. What's the meaning of the way? What way? What meaning? Back and forth, and certification, and then you get a little thing in the mail that says you're certified. So where do you go? What do you do when you think you have this realization, but you want to make sure, you want to get it tested? Where would you go? It's not so easy, because as Avatamsaka says, finding masters like this is like finding unicorns and phoenixes. Very rare. Very rare. You can't go online. And even here it says, this opening line says, two ways to interpret it. Have you not seen people who study as end and so forth? It doesn't mean, it could mean they're rare and have you not seen them, but it could also mean they're not very visible. Because they don't put out an advertisement saying, I'm a sage or enlightened. So it's like, how would you see them? How would you recognize them even? See, this is difficult. But at the same time, the Buddha anticipated the situation that perhaps there wouldn't be an awakened master of this degree available to you. Then how would you go about testing, making sure? You flip a coin. No, how would you do it? Anybody know? I mean, the teaching on this, I'm not making up the Buddha actually anticipated this. Well, one is you take the Dhamma Vinaya as your teaching, as your teacher. So you test it against a very close reading and understanding of the text, especially texts like the Samdhi Nirmochana and the Shrangama Sutra. Because the Shrangama Sutra is filled with testing mechanisms to take you through and to see if you have or don't have a liberated understanding. And it gives you a lot of caveats and warnings about if you think it is, but then you've got this little element here, you need to be careful that it's not. So you can use these as testing mirrors. That's certainly one way you can go. The other way to go is, for me, more immediate and practical, is, are you having any arising of klesha? If there's some klesha arising, you can be sure you're not a Buddha. Now, what does that mean? Klesha is greed. Well, I passed that one. I don't have any greed. I only take what I need. I don't have any excessive wants or desires. Really? And I have no anger or aversion. I don't get pissed off at anybody. And I'm totally clear at all times. I'm never jealous. I'm never envious. I never get anxious or worried. I never have kind of rigid intellectual opinions that I refuse to give up, and so on and so forth. And it's like I say, you go through the list. There's major, there's intermediate, and there's minor. And you can go through the checklist. You can kind of do your klesha hunt. Well, yeah. Oh, that one? I kind of thought that was one of my best sides. Righteous indignation. You know, you just keep going through. Once you do that klesha hunt, if you come up clean, it doesn't prove, but it's a pretty good indication. So the Buddha here was saying, what you're trying to liberate is your klesha. That klesha is your frozen bodhi, your frozen Buddha. By thawing those, Buddhahood manifests by itself. So it's right within human, the very human things that are described in those klesha that you test yourself to see. And in fact, it doesn't, I could lecture this till, flowers fell from the sky with eloquence or whatever, but unless there's removal of klesha, there's no awakening. And you can have far out spiritual states. You can read other people's thoughts. You can know your past lives, and so on and so on and so on and so forth. And if you still have klesha, it's not the thing. So this is really pretty good. Now, one of the ways you get to have freedom from klesha is avoid people that point it out. So just hang around people who are, I call, klesha friendly. Oh, you're so good. You're so smart. She had it coming, really. That kind of thing. You really want to avoid people that don't rub a little on klesha. So all you do is get married, and then no. Okay, I'm stopping there. I'm getting way into too much editorializing. But we had the list. We did it. One of the exercises we're doing in our graduate program is we're asking the students to do a laboratory exercise of going through the list and just checking themselves against it in a very neutral way to say, oh yeah, that's that. And then the next stage is to what the teachings recommend of how you untie the klesha, how you work through them systematically. So it's not just academic study, but it's actually using the text both as a window and as a mirror to self-reflect. So, yeah. Okay, announcements? Anything?
Well, tomorrow, I'm sure it's getting that Milpitas from like the 3, because it's only in Chinese though, so it might have simultaneous translation.
Milpitas, California,
Yes.
not Milpitas, China.
No.
Okay, it's all in Chinese?
There's a monk coming from the Abbot Dharma Drum Monastery, Dharma Master Hui Neng, who's going to be having a dialogue with him.
In Chinese?
In Chinese, because he only speaks Chinese.
Ah.
Yeah.
I've learned a long time ago never to do that. My Chinese is such that I would insult somebody within 5 minutes, even though I thought I was praising them. I remember my first time really practicing Chinese. I thought I had it down, and I was really sick, and I needed some milk for my medicine. And one of the monks with me said, "Do you want me to?" "No, don't ask. I can do my own Chinese." So I said, "Here's what I need in Chinese." And so I said, "Ni dong bu dong, you understand?" "Oh, wo dong, wo dong." And they came back with laundry soap. So after that, very cautious about my Chinese abilities.
Pretty good.
But there'll be a lecture tomorrow night, correct?
Yeah, we'll lecture regular tomorrow night.
Uh-huh.
And we're having the Guan Yin session coming up very soon. November 4th through 11th. It's a little late to sign up. If you really want to go, you probably can talk to Kin back there, and she probably can maybe get you a room. Other than that,
Do you know who Ken back there is? Ken back there, raise your hand. There, that's Ken back there.
yeah.
We're not closing till Sunday, so you still get.
You can still sign
Still
up.
possibilities.
RPUX.org. So, but anything else?
I have a weird question. So in the morning when I come from meditation, then I'm made to sit there, and then I'm made to sit here, and in this session it's the opposite. I just wanted to understand, is there any logic behind this?
Any logic? Oh, what logic?
Because in the morning, the energy for awakening is stronger over there. And in the evening, it's over here. There's no logic whatsoever. It's basically, because it's a monastery where the monks have taken vows of, celibacy, and therefore, just in courtesy, we keep the two sides, and it actually doesn't matter which side. Whether, men sit here, women sit there, women sit here, men sit there. And actually, if we do the meditation right, you wouldn't even know. But as a thing, you're trying to figure out, well, where am I supposed to go if you're the first one here?
Yeah, I was sitting here and going, yeah, so
You can't get enlightened here. You gotta go over there. Yeah. Okay. All right. We'll do the transference in English. But that is to remind you, there is open meditation here in the morning from,
6:15 to 7:15.
and then in the evening?
5:15 to 6:15.
Right.
I think there's actually a practical reason why the dinners are on which side, but we can tell that reason later. May every living being, our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light break the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Respect to the three jewels.